I was the assistant they ignored. My one email froze a $900 deal. I never thought a single email could stop a $900 million deal cold, not in all my years of working quietly behind other people's names. But that morning, sitting alone in my small, overlooked corner office with a chipped mug of coffee that had already gone cold, something finally clicked inside me, something that had been building for decades without me even realizing it. Because for most of my life, I had been the kind of man people looked through instead of at. The kind of man who blended into the background of glass walls, polished floors, and expensive suits, a 52-year-old assistant who knew everything that mattered and yet was treated like he knew nothing at all. And as I stared at my computer screen, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and confident voices drifting from the executive wing down the hall, I realized with painful clarity that none of them had any idea who they were dealing with or how much control they had unknowingly placed in my hands. For more than 30 years, I had been the quiet engine behind other people's success, the one who stayed late fixing mistakes that weren't mine, the one who remembered details no one else bothered to write down, the one who caught errors before they exploded and quietly corrected them so no one would ever know there had been a problem in the first place. And I had done all of that without applause, without promotion, without so much as a sincere thank you, because in that world, attention belonged to the loud. The aggressive, the polished talkers who knew how to sell confidence even when they lacked substance, while men like me were expected to keep our heads down and be grateful just to have a chair in the room. I had watched kids half my age walk in with shiny degrees and big smiles, stumble through presentations I had practically built for them, and walk out with bonuses and praise while I sat in the back taking notes, nodding politely, swallowing my frustration, telling myself that patience was a virtue and loyalty would eventually be rewarded, even as year after year passed and nothing changed. That morning was supposed to be no different, just another day of prepping documents and double-checking numbers for what everyone was calling the deal of a lifetime, a massive merger that had executives buzzing like gamblers who thought they'd already won, a deal so big it was being whispered about in elevators and bragged about at dinners, a deal that was going to make reputations and careers overnight. And my role, as always, was to support quietly, organize files, polish slides, and stay out of the way while the real players took the stage. But as I opened the final presentation draft in my inbox, my eyes stopped on a line that didn't sit right with me, a small detail buried under layers of impressive language and bold projections, the kind of detail most people skim past because they're too busy imagining the applause at the end. And my chest tightened as I followed that thread, cross-checking it with contracts, timelines, and regulatory notes I knew by heart because I was the one who had compiled them in the first place. The more I looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a typo or a minor oversight, but a serious flaw, a quiet but deadly gap that could expose the entire deal to legal challenges and financial fallout, the kind of mistake that wouldn't show its face until it was far too late, when money had already changed hands and blame would be flying in every direction except toward the people who deserved it. I felt that familiar urge to stand up, walk into the boardroom, and point it out calmly the way I always did, but I also felt something else, something sharper and heavier, because I already knew how that scene would play out. I could picture it perfectly, the impatient glance, the dismissive wave of a hand, the forced smile that said, "Not now," or worse, "Don't worry about it," followed by someone else rephrasing my concern 5 minutes later and getting credit for it. And in that moment, the weight of all those years of being ignored settled on me like a physical thing, pressing down on my shoulders, reminding me of every time I had spoken up only to be brushed aside, every time I had warned someone and been told I was overthinking, every time I had done the right thing and watched someone else benefit from it. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant clatter of keyboards. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel tired or resigned. I felt clear, almost calm, because I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before, which was that respect in that place was never going to be handed to me just because I earned it quietly. It was only going to come if I forced people to see the consequences of ignoring me. That was when the idea formed, not as a burst of anger or some dramatic urge for revenge, but as a cold, steady decision, because I knew I didn't need to raise my voice or embarrass anyone publicly to make my point. All I needed was the truth, laid out cleanly and undeniably, delivered in a way that couldn't be interrupted or brushed off. I turned back to my computer, opened a new email, and for a moment my fingers hovered over the keyboard as decades of habit urged me to soften my words, to be polite, to phrase everything as a suggestion. But I pushed that instinct aside and wrote the way I always thought, but rarely allowed myself to express, clear, direct, and exact, laying out the flaw, its implications, and the very real risk it posed to the entire deal, referencing documents, clauses, and timelines with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the ground better than anyone else in the room. I didn't accuse anyone, I didn't beg for attention, and I didn't add unnecessary emotion. I simply stated the fact.
I spent over 3 decades in the corporate world, a lifetime threading my way through endless hallways of glass, polished floors that reflected the shoes of people far more ambitious and far more noticed than I ever was. Starting out as a young clerk fresh out of college, timid and eager to prove myself, yet invisible to almost everyone around me, a face in the crowd who fetched coffee, typed endless reports, and carried stacks of paper from one office to another. Always with a polite smile and an accommodating nod, the kind of nod that told others, "I see you, but I won't make waves." And for years, that's exactly what I did, because in those early days, I believed that patience and hard work would eventually get me noticed, would eventually get me promoted, would eventually earn me the recognition I quietly craved. Yet instead, I found that the world rewarded bluster, rewarded showmanship, rewarded the loud and dismissive, while ignoring those who toiled silently behind the curtain. And so I learned to blend in, to observe, to memorize the details that everyone else overlooked, to learn the inner workings of departments and clients, the habits of managers and the expectations of executives, and the quirks of the most difficult clients, storing all this knowledge like a secret map that only I could read. And over the years, as I climbed slowly but deliberately, I realized that while my peers might pass me by, they relied on me more than they would ever admit, because I was the one who knew the numbers inside out, who could anticipate mistakes before they happened, who could patch problems silently and prevent disasters without ever needing praise or acknowledgement. And yet, despite all this, people still assumed I had no ambition, that my life was content in subservience, that I had no thoughts beyond carrying out their orders. And it was a lie I never corrected, because I knew the moment for correction would have to be perfect, strategic, undeniable, and most importantly, when they least expected it. For decades, I watched incompetence celebrated, shortcuts praised, and disloyalty rewarded. And each time, I stored the lessons, remembering that recognition in the corporate world was a luxury not afforded to people like me. But knowledge and timing were weapons that no one could ever take away. And by the time I was 52, I had learned 2 hard truths. Never rely on recognition, because it was fleeting and often undeserved. And always prepare for the moment when your patience snaps, because one well-timed action could overturn years of being ignored. And that moment, I realized, had arrived in the form of a merger between 2 of the largest companies in the United States, a deal valued at $900 million, a deal that could make or break careers overnight, and I had been entrusted, ironically, invisibly, overlooked, to prepare the presentations, organize the files, and ensure that every single number was accurate, every document polished, and every step aligned. Yet as I went through the material with my familiar meticulous eye, the one that had saved the company from minor disasters countless times before, I noticed a flaw so subtle yet so devastating that it could bring the whole deal to a screeching halt. A critical error buried under layers of reports and charts that no one else had spotted. A ticking time bomb of oversight that could lead to catastrophic financial exposure and legal complications if it went unnoticed. And I knew immediately that no one around me, with all their degrees and flashy suits, had the insight to see it. And as I sat there, reviewing and rechecking the numbers, I felt a mixture of dread and anticipation, knowing that this was the stage I had been waiting for, the moment where everything I had accumulated over 30 years, knowledge, experience, intuition, and patience, would finally be tested, a moment where being invisible was no longer a limitation, but a secret advantage, because the power to act decisively lay in my hands alone. And I realized that the quiet, unnoticed assistant who had spent decades in the shadows was about to decide the fate of a $900 million deal. A fate that would expose the incompetence of those who had ignored me for years and finally demand that the world take me seriously, not as a clerk, not as an assistant, but as someone who had seen everything, known everything, and was finally ready to act. As I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the boardroom that morning, a chill ran down my spine, not from the air conditioning, which was mercilessly cold as always, but from the palpable tension that seemed to hum in the room like electricity waiting to spark. Senior executives already arguing over minor points, as if the fate of the company depended on their immediate dominance, junior analysts rushing about, flipping through papers, clicking laptops, jotting notes with that anxious energy that comes from knowing your work is being judged but not trusted, while client representatives sat back in their chairs, sipping coffee, their expressions carefully neutral, pretending they had no inkling that the financial behemoth they were about to merge with might be sitting on a monumental error that could unravel months of negotiation. And I, a 52-year-old assistant who had spent decades silently observing every maneuver in these rooms, felt the familiar sting of invisibility as I cleared my throat, hopping to draw attention to the discrepancy I had discovered in the spreadsheets, the flaw that had been buried under layers of charts, forecasts, and summaries that everyone else had taken at face value. And before I could even form the words, a CFO, a man who had always regarded me as an extension of his desk rather than a human being capable of insight, waved me off with that casual arrogance that never failed to inflame me, saying, "Rick, we've got this. Just take notes," as if my decades of experience, my meticulous preparation, and my understanding of the deal were irrelevant, invisible, non-existent, and the humiliation hit me like a hot blade. But I swallowed it, keeping my calm because I had long learned that anger alone was useless, that raw emotion without strategy was just noise that could be used against you. And so I retreated to the corner of the room, opened my notebook, pretended to scribble notes. Let the false anonymity shield me while inside. A storm of thoughts and calculations raced through my mind, cataloging every mistake, every oversight, every lapse in judgment I had been forced to witness silently over the years, each one now magnified by the stakes of the $900 million deal that was teetering on a knife edge. And as I watched the executives continue their bickering, oblivious to the real danger lurking in their own numbers, I felt a sharp clarity. Every face in that room, every gesture, every word spoken in arrogance, was fuel, building a fire of determination that I had carefully nurtured for decades, because they had no idea that the person they had consistently ignored, dismissed, and underestimated was not only aware of the disaster about to unfold, but also capable of preventing it. And that realization brought with it both satisfaction and pressure. Because I understood fully that the power to stop a catastrophe rested entirely in my hands, invisible though I was. And I faced a choice that morning that would define everything from that moment onward. To continue fading into the background, letting the incompetence and pride of others dictate the outcome, as I had done so many times before, or to act decisively, to leverage the knowledge and skill that no one had valued for decades, and in doing so, to force them to finally recognize what they had been blind to all these years. The quiet authority of someone who had learned the hard way that being overlooked was not weakness, but a tool, a weapon that, when used correctly, could reshape the balance of power in the room, expose their fragility, and demand respect. And as the meeting dragged on, filled with unnecessary interruptions and misguided assumptions, I realized that this was the exact moment I had been waiting for, the moment when patience, silence, and meticulous preparation could be transformed into decisive action. And I knew, with a cold certainty that both thrilled and terrified me, that whatever happened next, I would no longer be invisible. That the knowledge I carried, the experience I embodied, and the oversight I had caught would finally be recognized, and that recognition would not be gentle, it would not be polite, it would arrive like a wave, sweeping through the boardroom, demanding attention, reshaping respect, and proving that a man who had been underestimated for decades was not only capable of action, but capable of changing everything in a room filled with people who thought they held all the power, and in that tense, charged atmosphere, I felt the stirring of a plan forming in my mind, a careful, calculated, unstoppable plan that would take the very thing they had ignored me for, their assumption that I was powerless, and turn it into the lever that could halt a colossal deal in its tracks, and finally force them to see me not as an assistant, but as the one person they should have listened to all along.
I had given this company everything a man could give without signing over his soul. My nights blurred into early mornings under fluorescent lights. My weekends sacrificed to deadlines that always seemed more urgent to everyone else than they did to me. Birthdays missed, family dinners cut short, friendships slowly fading because I was always just finishing something, all in the quiet belief that loyalty mattered, that if I showed up consistently, solved problems before they exploded, and stayed dependable when others chased credit, someone would eventually notice and say my name with respect. But over the years, that belief eroded piece by piece as I watched the executives who called themselves my mentors smile warmly in private while stealing my ideas in public, rewriting my work just enough to claim it as their own, presenting solutions I had quietly developed as if they had sprung fully formed from their own brilliance. And each time it happened, I told myself it was just how the system worked, that staying professional meant swallowing resentment and moving on. Yet the pattern repeated itself so often that it became impossible to ignore. My warnings brushed aside with casual arrogance, my emails unanswered until someone else echoed the same concern weeks later and received praise for being insightful. And every promotion that passed me by felt less like bad luck and more like a deliberate choice. A message that in this world respect belonged not to those who understood the details or protected the company from harm, but to those who spoke the loudest, interrupted the most, and sold confidence regardless of substance. I remember sitting at my desk late one night, staring at a half-empty office floor, realizing how quietly my life had narrowed around this place, how much of myself I had poured into an organization that saw me as replaceable, as a tool rather than a man, and that realization burned deeper when the $900 million deal came into focus. Because this wasn't just another routine project, this was a massive merger that would affect thousands of employees, investors, and clients. A deal that would be talked about for years, and I knew with absolute certainty that if the critical error I had found went unaddressed, the clients would be blindsided, the fallout would be enormous, and the same people who had ignored my warnings would scramble to protect themselves, pointing fingers, rewriting narratives, and letting the damage land wherever it may. And despite everything, despite the years of being overlooked, a part of me still believed that if I did the right thing and raised the issue through the proper channels, someone would listen, that loyalty might finally be reciprocated in this moment of truth. So I asked my manager for a private conversation, closed the door behind us, and carefully laid out the problem, explaining the discrepancy, the potential consequences, and the urgency with a calm precision born of experience. Hoping he would hear not just the words but the weight behind them. But instead of concern or curiosity, he laughed, not a cruel laugh, but an easy, dismissive one, the kind that told me he had already decided I wasn't worth taking seriously. And he leaned back in his chair and said I was overthinking it, that the senior team had already signed off, and that I should focus on my actual duties, those words landing harder than any outright insult because they reduced decades of experience to a checklist of menial tasks. And in that moment, something inside me cracked open, not in anger, but in clarity, because I finally understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a temporary oversight. It was a system that thrived on using people like me while keeping us invisible, a system that rewarded loyalty only when it was loud and performative, never when it was quiet and consistent. Walking back to my desk after that conversation, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when a long internal argument finally ends, because I realized that the betrayal wasn't just personal, it was structural, and expecting fairness from people who benefited from ignoring me was foolish. And that realization hit me like I went back to my office slowly, closed the door behind me, and sat down in my chair as if I had all the time in the world, even though my heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my ears. And I stared at the blank email on my screen where the cursor blinked steadily, almost patiently, like it was waiting to see what kind of man I really was after all these years, because I knew this could not be rushed, it could not be emotional. And it absolutely could not sound like an assistant whining for attention, since the smallest hint of frustration or tone would give them an excuse to dismiss everything I was about to say. And so I reminded myself of something I had learned the hard way over 30 years. Facts delivered calmly are more dangerous than anger shouted loudly. And if I was going to do this, it had to be flawless, not just correct, but undeniable, so I leaned back, took a long breath, and began working the way I always had when no one was watching, methodical, patient, relentless, pulling up contracts I had helped organize months earlier, rereading clauses most people skimmed because they were buried in dense language, cross-checking timelines against regulatory requirements, matching projected revenue against obligations that hadn't been properly disclosed, and slowly, carefully, I built the full picture, not just of the mistake itself, but of what it meant, how it could unfold, how it could quietly unravel the entire deal once it was too late to stop it. And the more I dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't a small oversight at all but a structural flaw, one that would invite scrutiny, lawsuits, and reputational damage if anyone outside that boardroom noticed it first. And that knowledge didn't make me angry anymore, it made me focused, because now I wasn't just protecting myself, I was protecting the truth, and I knew that truth, presented properly, would corner them in a way no raised voice ever could. I spent hours shaping that email, not writing it once, but rewriting it again and again, stripping out anything that sounded personal, anything that hinted at history or resentment, until all that remained was clean, sharp logic, every claim supported by documentation, every risk explained in plain terms, every conclusion leading naturally to the next, so that even someone determined to ignore me would have to slow down and think, because there would be nowhere to hide. No way to say they hadn't been warned, and as the afternoon light shifted outside my window and the office noise faded into a dull hum, I realized something that surprised me, which was that this didn't feel like revenge in the way people usually talk about it, loud and messy and driven by rage. It felt controlled, almost respectful, because I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone or tear anyone down. I was simply refusing to protect people who had chosen not to listen. And there was a quiet power in that, a power I had never allowed myself to feel before. When the email was finally done, I read it slowly from beginning to end. After I hit send, I leaned back in my chair, hands trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from the adrenaline of knowing that something irreversible had been set in motion. And I began watching the email thread with the intensity of a hawk circling its prey, eyes flicking between the notifications and the faint ping of incoming replies, knowing with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me that this one message, carefully calibrated and surgically precise, had landed in the inboxes of every executive involved in the deal, a deal that until this moment had been treated as untouchable, sacrosanct, the crown jewel of the company. And as the minutes stretched into hours, I noticed the usual hum of the office fading, a strange quiet settling over the normally bustling floor, as if the energy itself had sensed the shift, the chatter dying down to murmurs, the tapping of keyboards slowing, and I could hear it all with heightened awareness. Whispers carrying between cubicles, the echo of hurried footsteps packing in the hall, phones ringing with urgent tones, voices low and tense as calls were made, questions asked in clipped, anxious sentences, and every sound painted a picture in my mind of the storm I had just unleashed without a single raised voice or dramatic confrontation, because the power of this email lay not in theatrics, but in the quiet, undeniable logic it carried, and I could see its effects first in the face of the CFO. Usually so confident, whose posture had stiffened, whose jaw tightened, whose expression looked momentarily like someone had struck him in the gut, eyes scanning and rescanning the text, murmuring numbers and clauses under his breath. And then in the CEO, a man who had barely given me more than a passing glance over the years, his brows furrowed, lips pursed, rereading each line as though the words themselves were a puzzle that refused to make sense. His usual composure replaced with something closer to disbelief, while the junior staff, those nervous young analysts who had spent months learning procedures I had mastered decades ago, exchanged glances that were equal parts fear and fascination, silently acknowledging the invisible hand that had disrupted the carefully choreographed narrative they had all been performing. And beyond the walls of our office, the clients were on calls, demanding explanations, asking questions that no one in the room could answer, because the flaw I had exposed was monumental, the kind of oversight that could unravel months of negotiation if mishandled. And I sat there quietly, watching every reaction, every pause, every shuffle of papers and frantic typing, feeling a cold thrill as the gravity of the situation unfolded exactly as I had anticipated, because the beauty of it was that it wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. It was about the undeniable truth asserting itself in a world that had long ignored it, and as the hours wore on, the consequences became clearer. Contracts that had been prepared with such care were now on hold. The deal that had won. The week that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in my decades at the company. The office, once a static ecosystem where hierarchy and habit dictated every glance and every nod, seemed to pulse with a different energy, a quiet but undeniable shift that I sensed the moment I walked in on Monday morning, because the same executives who had treated me as an afterthought, whose laughter had dismissed my ideas, and whose arrogance had assumed my silence was compliance, were now approaching me with a mixture of caution and curiosity, subtly altering their tone. Carefully choosing words, as if unsure how to address the man they had long ignored, and emails that had previously been left unanswered for hours or days now pinged back almost instantly, short, polite, sometimes deferential, as if acknowledging my presence had become a priority overnight. But it wasn't simply recognition that stirred something inside me. It was validation, the kind that settles into your bones, quiet but profound. Because after years of watching incompetence be rewarded and diligence overlooked, they were finally seeing, really seeing, what I had known all along. That I was competent, decisive, and that their negligence, their habitual disregard for the details and the quiet people behind the scenes, had nearly cost the company everything. And as I navigated the halls that week, overhearing hushed conversations, noticing managers consulting with me before acting, catching glances that lingered longer than necessary, sensing the subtle ruckalabrushing of respect and authority, I realized with a mix of satisfaction and calm triumph that my silent intervention had redefined the dynamic in ways that no memo or meeting could have achieved, because the truth, once delivered and undeniable, does not require embellishment, and I watched, almost in slow motion, as the panic that had rippled through the upper echelons of management transformed into cautious respect, as people who had once spoken over me now paused to listen. As conversations that had been dominated by ego and assumptions shifted toward careful analysis, and as my presence, which had long been ignored, began to carry weight without me uttering a single word beyond that meticulously crafted email, while the $900 million deal itself remained frozen, contracts suspended, negotiations on hold, and the company scrambled to untangle the very problem they had brushed aside for weeks, all because I had dared to act. All because I had refused to remain invisible in the face of potentially catastrophic consequences, and in those moments, I felt a deep, almost serene satisfaction, not because anyone had been embarrassed or because I had caused panic, but because knowledge, patience, and careful strategy had been recognized as the powerful forces they truly are, because I had By the time the dust settled, when the deal that had teetered on the edge of disaster was finally renegotiated, polished, and cautiously set back on track, the company had no choice but to recognize the role I had played, the quiet but decisive intervention that had prevented a catastrophe. And for the first time in over 3 decades, the invisible assistant who had been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated was acknowledged openly, not with hollow words or temporary gestures, but in a way that altered the dynamics of the office permanently. I was promoted, my insights were actively sought, and colleagues who had once ignored my presence now paused for my opinion, recalibrating their assumptions and demonstrating, subtly but unmistakably, that the years I had dedicated, the late nights, the weekends spent poring over spreadsheets and contracts, the patience I had cultivated while watching incompetence thrive and loyalty be dismissed, had finally been valued, and yet, even more than the formal recognition, the title. The change in seating arrangements, or the polite congratulations that came my way, I felt a profound, almost intimate sense of personal victory, a deep satisfaction that came not from ego but from justice realized, because I had taken decades of quiet effort, painstaking diligence, and long-suppressed knowledge, and transformed them into leverage, turning humiliation into authority, invisibility into influence, and betrayal into triumph. And the lesson, crystallized so clearly in that moment, was not merely about professional advancement or vindication, but about the enduring power of preparation, patience, and strategic action. Loyalty, while noble, can be ignored in a world driven by appearances and ego, but knowledge, when applied decisively, carries a weight that no dismissal can counter, and the memory of years spent unseen became the foundation of authority, because the act that had seemed small in the moment, the careful, precise email that exposed the flaw, had reshaped perception and rewritten the rules of engagement in a single stroke, demonstrating that sometimes one quiet, well-considered action can change the entire game. And as I moved through the office now, walking past desks that had once overlooked me, overhearing managers and executives consult with me directly, seeing the subtle nods of respect that replaced once dismissive glances, I understood fully that the lessons of my life, the patience that had seemed endless, the loyalty that had seemed invisible, the meticulous observation that had gone unnoticed, had not been wasted at all. And that those who had underestimated me for decades had learned the hard way that ignoring someone who listens carefully, watches quietly, and acts strategically is a costly mistake, one that could have derailed a $900 million deal, damaged reputations, and forced even the most confident executives to pause and reckon with the reality that the quietest, least flashy individuals are often the ones who carry the greatest power. And in that understanding, looking back on everything that had transpired, the chaos and tension, the hidden errors, the weeks of whispers and cautious glances, and the final recognition that had once seemed impossible, I understood that the true lesson extended far beyond the immediate thrill of having been right or the satisfaction of having executed a perfectly timed intervention. It was about understanding your own worth in a world that often overlooks the quiet, the diligent, and the patient, about recognizing the value you carry even when no one else acknowledges it, and about having the wisdom to know exactly when to speak and when to act, because timing, more than volume or theatrics, is what turns knowledge into power, and years of being ignored had taught me that lesson in ways no book or mentor could ever convey, showing me that life does not reward patience immediately, and it often favors the loud, the flashy, and the aggressively self-promoting, yet that does not equate to the powerless existence of those who choose to observe, to learn, and to wait for the moment when their accumulated insight can have the most impact. And in that understanding, I realized that one's influence does not need to be broadcast through dramatic gestures, confrontations, or ostentatious claims of authority, because sometimes the quietest, most calculated actions carry a force far stronger than the clamor of the ambitious, the careless, or the arrogant. And that morning, when I had crafted and sent that single, meticulously precise email, I hadn't just pointed out a flaw in a $900 million deal. I had leveraged decades of experience, foresight, and patience into a decisive act of silent justice, an act that forced a room of confident executives who had once disregarded my very existence to pause, reevaluate, and acknowledge the value I had always brought to the table. And in the aftermath, as contracts were frozen, negotiations halted, and discussions recalibrated to accommodate the flaw I had exposed, I saw how quietly, almost imperceptibly, authority had shifted, not because I had shouted or demanded attention, but because competence, courage, and well-timed action demand recognition when all else fails. And as I moved through the office in the following days, observing the subtle changes in how colleagues approached me, the newfound respect in their cautious inquiries, and the deference that replaced previously dismissive gestures, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment that went beyond personal triumph. For I had proven to myself and to others that invisibility does not equal weakness, that the patient observer can wield extraordinary influence, and that quiet justice, applied thoughtfully, precisely, and decisively, can reshape perceptions, command attention, and teach lessons more enduring than any confrontation could. And in that realization, I understood, perhaps for the first time in my life, that true power is not always loud or visible, that it resides in preparation, insight, and the courage to act when the moment is right, and that one calculated, calm, and strategic intervention can not only avert disaster, but also permanently alter how the world sees you. And so for the first time, I wasn't just seen, I was respected. And in that respect, I discovered a satisfaction that no promotion, bonus, or title could ever match, because it was built not on privilege or posturing, but on the undeniable force of knowledge, patience, and courage applied at exactly the right time, a lesson that would stay with me far longer than the fleeting panic,